Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I would say like I should have you travel with me. That was an amazing introduction. Thank you. All right, so let's just hop in. It's a Saturday. I know you teachers have been working all week long and you want your time. And so let's just get to it. All right, so this whole talk today is structured probably a little differently than you would see a normal kind of biology talk at a regular lecture. So throughout the talk, you're going to see some of my research, but some of it's just going to be framing and why I kind of do the stuff that I do and why I care about what I care about and why the work is important, but also ways that you can flip that into your own classrooms. And so across the lectures, there are going to be different kind of little notes talking about how this could be incorporated into your classroom. And they'll range from, as Marlon said, my sister is a early childhood teacher, so she teaches K and 1. So some things that you would do with that age group and things that you would do kind of with older age groups, and you can kind of scale up and scale down. And so that's kind of how this talk's going to go. So that it's going to frame a little different than you may see some other people do there. So we'll just see. All right, let's see how it goes.
Quick note, Dr. Duncan, we're seeing your presenter.
Oh, goodness, again with the slideshow. There we go. Now we're good. All right. So, and now I see like so many faces, and it's very nice to see faces, but I can't see faces. All right. So when we think about the brain, and you guys all know this, we really are thinking about the brain as kind of the command center for behavior. So when I even teach this to my neuro students at Vassar, we're using the brain as this conduit for behaviors, right? And all the other things that encompass behaviors, learning, all of that, impulse control, emotional regulation. All of these things are things that we can study as behaviors. And so the brain is, of course, going to be central to that. And so when we're trying to explain this to students, what we really want to understand is how the brain can organize these behaviors, how it responds to their environment, and how it changes those behaviors. So the brain is, again, this conduit, which is receiving information from the environment, but is also pushing out behaviors. And so that kind of conduit behavior is what makes it so amazing, but also where we can have such kind of issues and where we can kind of tweak things and see how our environment can shape our behavior, but also how what we can do can shape our behavior and vice versa. And again, as we get to it, how things like traumatic brain injury can then affect our behavior. And so as I kind of show images, I try in my own lectures and in lectures to other things to try and show as many kind of inclusive images. So we always tend to have images of scientists looking one way, and we always usually have images of people looking another way. And so I try to kind of give images that give that all of this is the same. So throughout the talk that you will see, their images I chosen are actually very specific to showing that this is affecting kind of everybody. All right. So when we're thinking about brain areas that affect children's behavior specifically, there are a couple of major areas. And so one are the things like the prefrontal cortex. We also have the area of the brain called the amygdala, which I love in many ways. Before I got into TBI, I was in a program that looked at behavioral neuroscience, and we spend a lot of time on the amygdala. Amygdala is a very cool thing. We will not talk about the amygdala too much today, but it's a very cool thing. And then, of course, the hippocampus. And so the hippocampus, again, is going to play a huge role in things like memory. And so for learning and behavior changes and things like that, especially how we relate to schools, the hippocampus, of course, is going to be a big part of that. But these three areas, and I kind of skipped over the prefrontal cortex, this is actually really, really important, especially as we get to older kids. I tell all of my students that their prefrontal cortex is still developing in college. And so you can know this if you look at first year freshmen versus our seniors or graduating seniors and the differences in how they make decisions and behavior changes. We know that brain is still very much developing up into, late college time. So the prefrontal cortex is also a really amazing part of this. And if you're trying to incorporate some kind of interesting ways of showing how science interacts with society, you really should look at the prefrontal cortex. And think about, there's a colleague here at Vassar who studies the way that juveniles are treated with the criminal justice system and how we think about, are their brains really able to be charged as adults? Because their brains really are not adults. And so we have this data that really shows that that adolescent brain is not an adult brain. And yet we often charge students or charge these adolescents as adults. And we know that their brains are not still adulthood brains yet. And so there is kind of, I think students sometimes separate science from society, but realize that those connections are there because the science influences our society and vice versa. We can, have science or society having effects back to the science there. But these are kind of the three major brain areas that we talk about specifically around children's behavior, because these are the behaviors you're seeing in the classroom, right? You're seeing issues with learning and memory, you're seeing issues, or you're trying to respond to their emotional responsiveness. Again, the kid who immediately fights versus the kid who maybe is crying. And you're seeing that they're making decision-making that's maybe not the best. And you're wondering why. And it's because these are the main areas that are still developing and still affecting their behaviors really strongly. So again, I told you throughout the talk, I'm going to have these little boxes. And so you'll see this little sign that says lesson plan. And so these are ways that these are actually lesson plans that you can incorporate. And I'll have a link at the end of the talk where you can find actually the full lesson plan. But these are different kind of plans that you can incorporate into your classroom. And so when we're just starting to think about brain areas and affecting children's behavior, well, the first thing you need to teach students is what are the kind of brain areas? What can these areas look like? And this one, of course, is one that I'm giving you this for kind of 6th to 8th graders, but I have actually done a version of this with kindergartners. And I did it with my own son's school, but I've done it with other groups as well. And you can use Play-Doh. And it's a similar lesson plan, and you can usually help Play-Doh to help kind of identify what we think a brain should look like. And so for when I do it with the younger kids, I use the Play-Doh and we're like, okay, if I'm an animal that swims, or if I have an animal that uses really big visual information, or if I have an animal that does certain kind of behaviors, what do we think that their brain should look like? And I give them examples of different brains so that they can start to map it together. And you can see that they'll design brains that have these kind of key characteristics. And so at that age, you can do it Play-Doh. They love it. They get to take the Play-Doh home. It's wonderful, right? And then as we get older, again, middle school age, you can actually get real brains for them to see and touch sometimes. Or you can do, again, this one is a sheep brain activity. And you can order these from your normal distributors. I think in the past, many people thought they had to be the ones that had really bad toxic chemicals. They actually make a safe fix now that you can use and just throw away in the trash after you're done. So there's nothing you need like in your house, gloves. You can actually do it without gloves. The safe fix is actually really safe. I wouldn't do it without gloves just because, kids are nasty and they put everything in their mouth. But you could, in theory, there's nothing toxic about it. But you can let them see like an actual brain, and they can touch it and they can feel the structures of the brain, and they can see and, open it up. You can cut it in half. You can just use things like, you don't have to use any kind of special knives. You can actually just use kind of like a butter knife and cut them open. It's quite easy. But you can actually identify and touch different lobes. And we can talk about the 4 kind of main lobes of the brain, and you can identify like this is generally what this part of the brain does, and this is generally what this part of the brain does. And you can actually have a couple of slides that map onto it. And so it helps people to realize kind of what the structure looks like. And then you can start connecting it to behaviors. You can talk a little bit about evolution if you want, but really you can start really kind of getting them to understand the brain as an organ. And so once we have that kind of larger image of the brain and connecting the brain to behavior, then I start to kind of get it further down. And so I start to say like, okay, so we have this large structure, but we also have these things that make up the brain, and we're getting them down to these smaller units. And so again, connecting back to some of those first structures we talked about, like the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, we know that they have to talk to each other. So we can make that connection between decision-making and emotion, right? Oh, how are our brain areas connected? Well, they're connected through these bundles or these neurons, right? And again, showing them that the physical structure actually maps on with these connecting neurons is the key there, right? I think we sometimes disconnect the two, but realizing that this physical structure is made up of these millions of neurons and these neuronal pathways, right? And so making that connection there, helping to show that how these pathways form, and that these pathways are actually helping children to learn, remember, manage their emotions, right? And again, why are we making this connection and why does it matter for behavior? Because when we're doing this, these strong pathways lead to better self-regulation and learning, right? So as we're going from these big structures, working our way down to these neurons, realizing that what's connecting them are these neuronal pathways, right? And the stronger pathways we have, the better self-regulation we have, the better learning that we have, the better students we have, right? And again, the opposite is going to be true. When we have these weak or underdeveloped pathways, we tend to see things like impulsive behavior. We tend to see emotional outspurts, right? We can make these connections between those two. Again, if you wanted to even take this to the high school level, you could get slides on microscopes, and you could actually look at neurons at that level, right? You can buy slides that have those kind of information. And so you could really make that connection between those levels. All right. So as we're making that connection, one of the best activities I think works for kind of really all groups, if you can talk about a neuron, is this pipe cleaner neuron assay or experiment. Sorry, assay is what happens when I'm in the lab too long. The pipe cleaner neuron activity or lesson plan. And with this one, you can really make this connection between kind of an underdeveloped neuron and what we would call kind of like a developed or a nice happy neuron, and then make another connection to synapses, right? So we have all of these neurons that we're saying are creating these pathways, and they're connecting to each other via these synapses, right? And those synapses and those connections are what we're talking about having the stronger or the weaker ones. And so when we get them into high school and college, you could really talk about how we can strengthen those synapses, weaken them, LTP, LTD. Like you could really go into a really kind of much more neuroscience specific one. But at this stage, it can be easy enough just to say, well, show me how you can draw a neuron that has lots of connections with other neurons versus one that doesn't. So if you look at image 1 here, image 2, or image 3, the different pipe cleaner shapes can show you how that neuron would have more or less connections with other neurons. And so if every student in the class makes one, you can show like, oh, well, make me an underdeveloped neuron. Oh, it can't talk to as many neurons as another one. It's going to have less of these pathways, and vice versa. And I also included in this some links, and so we're not going to go through the links, but PBS has some really great images of showing like actual neurons making these connections, and you can make the synapses and they can see it in real life, right? And so you'll have all these slides, I think, as well. And so you can click on any of these links, but they have really some great images pulled from actual scientists looking at these connections. And again, you can start to put it together, and the students can physically see how these neurons make these connections, where that synapse is happening, and how those different connections lead to these differences in learning and behavior. All right. So that provided a little bit of background. You're probably wondering, but she's supposed to be talking about TBI. We're getting there, promise. So we're talking about these neurons. We've laid the groundwork, and now we're going to bring up this term neuroplasticity, right? And so all of the things I've been talking to you about have been around this idea, but you have to have that background to get there. And so when we think about the brain of a child, right, we have this massive potential, right? We have all of these connections that are being made. Everything is kind of novel and new, and we're having this really great moment of synergy, right? And so we have this ability to do that when we're very young. As we get a little older, we find out that those connections get made. This is something that should happen, but we start to see that the rate slows down substantially, right? And so generally over the lifehood of a person, that rate of neuroplasticity actually goes down, right? It doesn't go to 0. So it's not like you're at the end, you're just done, but it decreases, and it's for good reasons. I think a lot of times people think that, well, why can't our brain stay plastic forever? And a good example would be when you're learning and you're young, you need these chances to have a lot of changes, make substantial changes to your brain, right? You want to be making these synaptic connections. You want to be making all of these connections with the world around you, physical stuff like walking, talking, things like that, but also new information. But as you get older, you actually don't want to lose some of those things, right? And so part of what neuroplasticity is that we wait. Like things that are really important, we're going to remember, and things that are less important, we're not going to remember. And so I was thinking about this today. My son had his band concert last week or earlier this week, and they were, testing the mics, and someone was like, do your alphabet. And the kid did it like A to Z. Clearly, we all know in English our alphabet A to Z. It is something that's in there. We don't lose it. But if I asked you to tell me the language you took in high school's alphabet A to Z, it's probably not there as much, right? It may be, and you could probably bring it back, but that one's much harder to pull, right? And so we weight things differently. Things that we're going to use for kind of our whole life, we want those connections to stay. Things we may not be using our whole life, like, again, my example, the German alphabet from A to Z song is not something that I'm really using on a daily basis. That one can go away. And so sometimes it's there. And I actually thought about this morning, and it was still there. It's a little bit in there. I forgot a little bit of it, but it came back after a couple of times. But we weight those things. And so neuroplasticity is all about making those decisions. At some point, your brain goes, this is important. This is a little less important, and we're going to weight one higher than other. And so that's generally how neuroplasticity is working. It's helping you to kind of change your brain, adapt, and weight things appropriately so that you can have time to learn and space to learn new things, and maybe let some things go. Now, that's in a perfect world. We have this brain that's constantly kind of learning, losing, deciding what's going to keep, and things like that. Unfortunately, in a not so perfect world that we unfortunately live in, we know that this isn't equal. Right? There are things that affect that neuroplasticity: trauma, poverty, what we would call an unstable childhood, right? All of these things can impact that ability for that brain to have this normal, what we call typical neuroplasticity response, right? And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then again, we're going to talk about how TBI specifically affects those features. All right. And so again, what I want you to remember is this imagery, right? So we could have lots of connections, kind of like in this one here, or we could have not so many connections. Like here, we're not making any connections on this side of this neuron with other neurons, right? And so if you were going to kind of guess which one of these would be someone who's suffered some kind of trauma versus someone who is not, right? It's a very physical thing to see. Right? And that's what we're going to talk about. They're going to be making less of these connections, and we're going to have less powerful connections. We're going to lead to more issues with emotional regulation, learning, and behavior. All right. So I kind of described brain plasticity there in many ways, but this is something like we want to talk to our students about. Have you ever heard the term brain plasticity, right? What does that mean? Why would it be important to me? And again, I use a couple of different definitions for it, but it's the unique ability of the brain to change. And what it's changing is new connections with other neurons. Again, making that connection between those structures and those neurons within the structure, right? Going back to what I started about, talking about my students here in college, that we know that the human brain is generally still developing for about 25 years, right? And that rate or that progress is going to depend a lot on both nature and nurture, meaning your environment and your genetics, right? Where your body came from, and also where it lives in this world, right? Those are all going to change the rates of that. But generally speaking, our brain is still developing for about 25 years, okay? We talked about those connections and emotional regulation. And again, that's going to be all related to development. So again, I like kind of put slides up here. I'm not going to go through all of these because I'm not actually going to go through this one either. You can watch these on your own, but I like to provide visual stimuli or visual kind of student references for my students as well. I know my own son, something that students can watch over and over again on their own time, whatever. And so these are all links in here that I think are just good ones for students to watch, but they can walk someone through neuroplasticity and how it can affect behavior. And so again, I try to make connections with students, and I think there are a lot of students that want science in their lives, but there's a lot of students who don't, right? And so what I try to think about is giving that science a connection to everybody, right? Anything we do can be related to the science and vice versa. In terms of neuroplasticity or changes in behavior, I think that if students understand, the ones that are interested in the brain stuff will be interested in the brain stuff, but also you can change it into terms that they may be used to. So like my son does like things like middle school essentials or like Project Lead the Way or all these kind of connections to kind of connect back to other subjects. I try to connect neuroplasticity to things like growth mindset, right? And so those tend to be terms that they can see across lots of classes. And so I think about it in terms of like a negative mindset versus a positive mindset, right? And so we can talk about these terms, and I think these are actually things that they're getting used to in K-12 and try and take these as terms that will help them up to college and beyond college, right? And, what happens if you made a mistake, right? What if you think something's too hard? What if I'm not good enough, right? Those would be like a negative things, and we're thinking about those in a negative mindset way. And what about a positive mindset would help here and say like, well, no, I'm going to learn by my mistakes. I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to try and make those connections. I'm going to try and teach my neuron to do it in a different way, right? I'm going to try some new strategies. And so I think if we can help students realize that connection between kind of growth mindset and neuroplasticity, then they can start to see how the structure changes the behaviors and how their behaviors can sometimes change that structure as well. And so, yeah, and I think there's some comments, and I'm bad again about comments. So if there's some like serious comments that someone's like, hey, take a second, go back over that slide, someone should just yell it out. Just tell me. That's easier for me to do than read comments. I'm sorry. So do that. All right. So what kind of factors affect neuroplasticity? And I've already given you a little bit that we talked about kind of your nature versus nurture, but what kind of factors can we study in the lab that it can affect neuroplasticity? And those kind of factors are things like the environment your person is raised in or animals are raised in. I'm going to give you an example of things like meditation. We know that that can have effects on neuroplasticity. We know that exercise can have effects on neuroplasticity. Age can have effects on neuroplasticity, and of course, trauma. So we've talked a little bit about age already, but we'll go back and talk a little bit more about that. We're going to go the other side of that, but we're just going to go through some examples that you can explore in your classrooms. So environment is kind of a nice one to start with. And again, it connects the science to kind of subjects outside of science. So, you can really bring in lots of different environment kind of questions here. Generally speaking, we know that the developing brain is easily molded. And so it tends to be very, very, very responsive to kind of stimulus or experience. And we just said that very broadly. We said kind of bad things tend to lead to less development. Good things tend to lead to better development. And so when researchers started looking at this, they looked at different environments. And what we meant by environments is where is this developing brain growing up, right? And so you can look at environments in a number of different ways. We tend to look at them as kind of an enriched environment and a not enriched environment, right? And so, or non-enriching environments. And so when we think about enriching environments, these tend to support brain development, right? And non-enriching environments impact it usually in a negative way, right? And again, this leads to this idea that both nature and nurture are going to play a role in our development. But how I connect it to students, and I think about things like social justice and things like that, is that our socioeconomic factors are going to play a role in our development, right? And so a kind of way to think about this in a different way. We know that a woman was born went 24 years without realizing she did not have a cerebellum. Now, we're going to talk about we talked very grossly about the brain, and one of the structures in the brain is the cerebellum. It's kind of cool looking if you actually see it on most animals. It looks distinctly different from the rest of the brain. It's kind of smooth and like, it's very cool. It's very cool. And so this person was born without it. So if you're looking on this map, this whole black area is where her cerebellum should have been. Okay. There is nothing there. And so she didn't even realize that for 24 years, right? She thought she was a little clumsy. She had done, some sports. She'd been fine. Like, there was not like she was falling over. Generally, your cerebellum is involved very heavily in smooth movements, right? And being able to navigate very smoothly in the world, right? And move generally in the world. She has, graduated from high school. She had a child, right? And what we think happened was actually neuroplasticity, right? Her ability to do this was because her brain adapted. It was basically like, oh, well, okay, I don't have this one part of the brain that would have been doing this task. It adapted. It was able to use its kind of environment, which was she was probably in an enriched environment that no one told her she couldn't do anything. So her brain was like, well, if I can't do it my normal way, or what I thought would be the normal way, I'm going to do it this way, right? And so it's amazing what our brain can do based somewhat just on environment, right? We can study this in the lab. And again, connecting back to those pipe cleaner examples, right? Here is how we study this in a lab. So we can have rodents who are raised in different environments. Sorry, it's clicking there. I don't know why it's doing it. Oh. Okay, there you go. And so we can have environments that are both more complex and kind of less complex, right? And so we find out that if you raise these rodents, and these are in this case rats, in a complex environment, and this is what their nerve cells tend to be like. So the pipe cleaner example, lots of connections, lots of branches, right? When we raise them in a standard environment, so they have food, they have water, they aren't by themselves. I mean, they may have one or two people. It's not like they're solo. They have much less connections, right? So they are still able to live. They have productive lives, but look how much different their brain cells are looking, right? And so over the time, we know that it's not just the physical structure of these things, right? We're seeing increased dendritic branching and length. We increase spine density, neural density, neurogenesis. That's the number of cells they're having. How many are surviving cell survival, right? But that has other effects on kind of the neural side, the neurochemical side, the molecular side. So they're producing more factors. They're having more neurotransmitters. They're having more receptors. They're having more protein expression, right? It's not just the neurons. The whole environment is different because of how they were raised. And again, as we make these connections to our students, I always use the example of kind of pre-K, right? The students who go through pre-K versus the students who don't go through pre-K, right? And if pre-K is not free, or kindergarten in some cases is not free, think about all those enriching environments that we supply for these students in pre-K and K that they aren't getting if they're coming into a school in, let's say, kindergarten or first grade, right? Those have made changes to their brains, reading to a student every day, having things to play with. All of those interactions have changed their brains. I think COVID is a really good example of this. And we all know this from the classroom, like finding out how our students have socially been kind of those that were very isolated versus those that had less isolation. We know that that led to differences in how they're interacting, how they're behaving now, right? And it's because of these differences in this kind of neuroplasticity and neurobehavior. Now, you're probably like, oh gosh, is this forever? And no, remember we said that brain is very plastic. We have the ability to change it, but we have to make that choice to say like, oh no, we need to do what we need to do to create this enriched environment versus not an enriched environment. Okay. All right. And so again, I wanted that molecular connection. So we do know that that's going to have actually genetic variations in those genes that we produce. But also if you look at things like early life adversity, so that same idea of using the environment, physical environment, but also different kinds of versions of that. So what if you had prenatal issues? So poor fetal growth, substance abuse or use, maternal anxieties or depressions, all of those we know can have effects on that developing fetus during partum. So if you had some variation in oxygenation during the delivery, that could have an effect on it. Postnatal, right? Low socioeconomic status. So again, that environment thing, parental quality, parenting quality, maternal depression still here, can all have effects. And these are those environmental effects that may affect how that brain is structuring. Specifically, again, looking at areas of the brain like the amygdala and the hippocampus are really, really affected by those types of changes, right? And so putting this all together, we know that by having these dysfunctions in environment, we're going to have problems later on, right? All right. So what about something positive? So in this one, we're doing meditation. Focusing one's mind in order to sharpen attention and overall awareness. That is what meditation generally is. Some people have a meditation practice, some people do not. We've seen it more and more kind of pop up into schools if we can find time. And the reason why is this. We know that meditation can lessen both anxiety and depression. We just talked about those prenatal effects on how that could affect the brain, right? Now this person is postnatal, they're outside the world. We know that that can have effects on adult behaviors such as chronic pain. We know it can improve memory. It can improve attention. It reduces inflammation. And when we talk about traumatic brain injury, you'll see why that's important as well. And so clearly it's something we should think about, right? And so we have started thinking about how this could change children's behavior and things like that, of course, in the classroom. And we do know that there actually are some physical changes to the brain that result after meditation. So meditation tends to have really big effects on 3 major areas of the brain. And again, 3 that you've seen already. We know it affects gray matter, which is, I'm not counting it, that's at 4 here, but really 3. Gray matter across the board tends to be involved and affected by meditation. But again, our 3 friends are back. The prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. All 3 of those we know play a role or are mediated by meditation. And so this is a lot of text, but it's mostly there so you can have it for yourself. I'm of course not going to read it. But again, this is another one of those kind of blocks that you could give students. Try some meditation in the classroom, right? It doesn't have to be very long. A lot of these meditation things are just like, 1 to 5 minutes. And allow the students to have a moment to think about it. We know that it can have huge effects on their behaviors by affecting those brain areas and changing those connections, right? And helping to strengthen those connections. And so you can do that in the classroom as just, hey, maybe you had a couple minutes here. Let's try some meditation. Let them have a moment. Or you can, again, connect it back to that basic neuroanatomy because we can make guesses. Like, if we did meditation every day for a month, what effect do we think it's going to have on these different brain areas? What do we think it's going to have effect on those pipe cleaner neurons, right? We can connect it all back to those connections that we're making in the brain. All right, number 3, exercise. I don't know how most of your students are. My son, even though hates changing out for PE now, still likes having PE, right? They need to get outside. And so exercise is one of those things that we know actually does have huge effects on their behaviors. And so we can make a strong connection between exercise and behavioral performance. Again, these are those learning, memory, things like that, behavior in the classroom, emotional regulation, executive functions. Some of these things still coming back together, right? All of those three brain areas that we are knowing are playing a huge role in these children's brains. We know it promotes neurogenesis, synaptic plasticity, right? It can increase brain volume and activity. We're going to get some new cell types that we haven't talked about yet, such as astrocytes. We'll talk about those again. We talked about those molecular factors that are being regulated by those kind of new exciting neurons, those trophic factors, things like that. And so we do know that exercise can have a huge effect on neuroplasticity and behavior by changing these mechanisms that we already know. And so what you're looking at here, again, are very specific ones that we can see on the right side. Again, I've already talked to a bunch about them, but we do know that we have these effects and just little bits of exercise. We're not asking for they don't need to be running a marathon, but they do need to kind of move their bodies a bit. And that's kind of what that physical movement is getting them to make these new connections. An interesting way of thinking about exercise in the classroom that connects it to maybe something you're already teaching is if you're thinking about transformations of energy and matter, right? There are lots of core concepts that we like to cover in biology. But this is one that specifically at my college that we have designed even our intro sequence around is like, how do we move energy, right? How do we move matter? Like you can look at it on many scales. And so this is kind of what this is from the Vision and Change documents and biology core guides, how you can kind of make those connections here. But this is one that I like to make with exercise in the classroom, because you can talk about lots of things like, hey, how do we create energy for our brains? And so what you're looking at here are energy for plant cells versus energy for kind of most animal cells, and how you can make connections between the two. And the students can see that connection between like plant photosynthesis. And again, this was something I would probably use in a higher class, but cellular respiration, right? And showing the connection in the two, and then connecting that to the brain. Like, okay, your brain is this structure. It also needs energy, right? How do we connect like something that we eat or foods that we eat or light from the sun? How are these all connected to how we power our brain? And you can even think about food scarcity, right? What happens if we don't have enough food? What happens if someone's not getting enough food in their diet? Oh, I can now see a very quick, easy way of connecting that to the energy that my brain gets. So if I don't eat breakfast in the morning, if I can't eat breakfast, or if I'm food insecure, right? Why would we see changes in behavior? It's because we're not powering the brain in the same way, right? And so it helps to kind of make that connection between the two. And you don't feel like you're losing time in teaching by teaching something else, right? We can clearly show a connection between these two and why it's important, right?
Just want to do a
yes,
quick 15-minute warning. So sorry about that. 15-minute.
Yeah.
So if you all have questions, get them ready.
Yes, perfect. Awesome. All right. So age, we've already talked about, but realize that that changes across the body of your body, that we tend to see less neurogenesis, less synaptogenesis as we get older. All right. I'm going to skip over this slide because timing is off. I added some new stuff and that's happened. So we're going to quickly get to some of my stuff so I can get done. Head trauma. That's what I study. Trauma affects your brains, right? I study specifically blunt traumas or blunt impacts and penetrating injuries. And so we know that trauma can have a negative effect on neuroplasticity, generally speaking. And so when we study it, we're studying the things that actually promote neuroplasticity. So generally, when you have a trauma to the brain, you're going to have lots of neuronal death. And then that's going to lead to bad things not usually happening. Your brain is changing in many ways. But we do know that there are some factors that reorganize the brain. And so those are the factors that I study in the lab. And I study using these cute little birds. These are zebra finches. they have a male and a female, and they actually have differences in their both behaviors and in their brains, right? So the males sing a song, the females do not, and it's actually completely regulated by neural pathways. Specifically, estrogens mediate the pathway. And so estrogens are produced by cholesterol, which is a steroid hormone, and it actually promotes neurogenesis in both males and females, but the males are the ones who actually have it survive, and that produces the singing behavior. You're probably wondering in this 1 minute, why am I caring about this at all? Because we found out that following a TBI, the brain produces more estrogens. And so we see this across animals, both in zebra finches and in other animals, such as mice. We see it in chickens. We see it in lots of different species, frogs, humans, everybody. Everyone does this response, which is following injury, they upregulate estrogen levels, okay? And we can test that in many ways. This is my data. We saw a significant increase in estrogen in the brain versus other parts of the brain, that didn't have an injury. And what this estrogen is doing is it actually controls injury. And so what you're looking at here in the red is the normal injury response, and we're looking at how big or small an injury gets. And then this is what happens when we block the estrogen. And so if you look at 24 to 72 hours, we get a much larger injury when we block it. And so that suggests that the estrogens are actually promoting this kind of neuronal survival and neuroplasticity. And if you take it away, they aren't doing it. All right, I'm going to stop there because I have other slides, but that's enough for now. Yeah, that was the main thing. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I think we had 1 minute, right? So I didn't want to go over my 1 minute.
That was super cool.
Very cool.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Duncan, for just an awesome lecture on your own data, which like I know everybody wants to play in more, an accessible lecture on the like lesson plans, the ideas to really implement this inside of classrooms, and one that's super accessible, like talking about brain regions and their relationship to behavior and to health and to development and to young people. So big kudos. We really, really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
I will turn it over to our wonderful Talk 2 scholars. First, see if they have any questions, vibes, thoughts, comments, feelings. What you got for Dr. Duncan?
Hi, I don't know if you guys can hear me. I'm on a computer that's seemingly very old. So
no, you're good. You're good.
Okay, great. So first of all, that was amazing. Like, two takeaways. One takeaway was that a lot of things that you like suggesting, like information you've given us last year, we were doing those things in the classroom. So like even with the pipe cleaners and like the brain molds with the clay, I still have clay in my room. So whenever you guys want to do that, I'm ready for it now. And like first of all, just thank you for that, because you just kind of like just re-energized me with that one.
Good.
And second takeaway, I was thinking about the meditation process you were talking about in the classrooms. And like, so for myself, I have a class or two that's a bit more, there's a CT class, you know, it's inclusive, so they have different diversities. That being said, I went from having like, I guess, more active like brain breaks in the beginning, like maybe 2 to like 5 minutes, like a break for them. That now I started doing this thing where I turned all the lights off just like 2 minutes, and like I put on like these silent like visual effects on like the YouTube videos they have over there, and then I just have them like either use that moment to like rest, relax, close their eyes, do a calming activity. And I do find that they do, I guess, behave. So right now you kind of like put the science behind the practice. So thank you so much. Now I know, you know, it's a useful thing. Not only does it, like, I guess, calm their minds, but it's actually helping with their brain growth.
Yes, it does. So that's really great. I'm glad that these are things, like I said, my whole thing was to try and give you actual things you can use in the lab and a little bit of science to kind of help make it exciting and fun for them. So that's glad. I'm glad that helped.
I had a question.
Yes.
I was thinking, how long does it take, I mean, like on average, to see an actual objective difference in neuroplasticity in the kids?
Yeah, so the way we define neuroplasticity is a change in behavior, right? And so any kind of change in behavior, we're going to say that that has been neuroplastic. If you weren't doing that behavior before and now you are doing it, then that would mean that we have changed that behavior and you've learned or you've done something that's changed your brain. And so generally speaking, if you're seeing a change in the behavior, then that means that the students' brains are changing, right? In a neuroplastic way. If you can, I mean, that's the whole basis of our education system is actually hoping that we're doing something that changes their behavior, and we measure that through tests and blah, 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 right? It's the issue with learning is how do you actually measure learning? You do it by change in behavior, and how do you measure that? It's the whole thing. But I would say with children, we know that they have this ability to do it, right? Pretty quickly. And if you start seeing changes in their behavior, that means that they are actually changing their brains, right? And that they're learning these new pathways, and their pathways are connecting in a way that means that you aren't teaching them the same thing over and over again and not getting a change, right? Those would be the ones you're worried about. If you've taught the same material every single day and you're never seeing a change, that suggests that their brains aren't changing. But if we are even seeing a slight change in behavior or a change in anything, that does suggest that they're having this kind of neuroplastic response. It's kind of nice, right?
That's such a hopeful remark.
Yeah, right? Like if you can change the behavior, that's the behavior. That's what we want to do. We want bigger changes in behavior often, but if you can at least change it a little bit, that's a change in the behavior.
More questions from our wonderful scholars?
I just have more or less a comment. So I really appreciated the lesson. This is specifically something, so like I work for a public charter, right? So you kind of tend to take on more of a role than just a teacher. So we also are advisors for our kids, right? And we have advisory once a week, and they provide advisory lessons. And one of the advisory lessons is teaching the kids about a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, right? And then they went into the background of, really, really lightly of a little bit of the neurology behind it, or like the reasoning behind it. But this is cool, like, especially if you're, like you said, you're going to share the slides with us. Like, I can use some of this information to help them maybe build a more like robust advisory lesson. And what's cool about it is it's school-wide. And like I have 12 advisees, my coworker has 12 advisees. So like this would be delivered across the school. So like I think this is some really cool information that I can push forward to like my administration and help them maybe make it more meaningful lesson in this sense, because a lot of it we just talk about, but we don't really go into like the actual mechanics or reasoning about it. So this is awesome, and I appreciate it. And it was definitely very comprehensible. My roommate, who's a civil engineer for the city, he could understand what you're talking about. He was asking me questions.
Great. That makes me happy. And that's good. Like I said, really my goal is science shouldn't be so over the top of everyone's head that it gets lost, because then it defeats the purpose, right? We have good science. Let's tell people our good science and
completely agree.
Explain it. Yeah.
That's even more, I would say that I would argue that in teenagers, right? They're very quick to lose.
Yes.
When you're talking over their head, they're like, all right, see you later, buddy.
Yeah. And this is something like help them make a connection to something you're interested in. You can find a connection between like anything. Like you could do a YouTuber, you could do a lot of things. If you start thinking about the connections between like, how many of us, TikTok is a good example of this. They're addictive by design, right? It's something about that is making your brain go, oh, now this, now this, now this, now this. Like, let's talk about this. What is your brain picking up? You can really dig into those things. And so it's kind of a cool model. I find the brain interesting.
I'm going to turn it over to questions from our chat. We want to read a note of appreciation from Crystal Nunez, who had to step out. Just have to step out early, but thank you so much for this lesson. Truly allows me to reflect as a teacher how to involve science to my students and how they show up to the classroom affects their learning. Thank you so much for the lesson as well. We'll be taking a look.
Great.
All right. So questions from our other CNI family. What else do you got? You got more on traumatic brain injury, more on plasticity, more on how to incorporate these things in your own life. You know, all yours. We've got a couple more minutes.
Yeah, I had a question. Thank you, Dr. Duncan, for that talk. That was really interesting. And I really like the connections that you made between kind of like society and science. I had a question about how you, in a controlled way, like create traumatic brain injury in your zebra finches. And like,
Yeah.
how do you like decide where that traumatic brain injury is going to be? And like, how is that? Because it's really hard to kind of create that because it's traumatic brain injury is usually like
Yeah.
something that just happens and it's like usually all over the brain.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we use two different traumatic brain injuries. One is a penetrating injury. So it's actually very easy to make a very precise one. We anesthetize the animal, we do a small craniotomy, and we put a needle in their brain. The brain area is the same across all the animals. So we use males, females. Sometimes we use younger birds versus older birds. We've done kind of age effects as well. And we always use, for us, one area of the brain that has not involved in estrogens. And so because I study estrogens, we use a part of the brain that we know should not have a normal estrogen response. And so when we see an estrogen response, we know it's because of the injury and not because of something else. And so that's how we control for brain area, estrogen levels, all of that. In the concussive injury model, that one's it's a different injury model. What you use is a weight apparatus. And so you basically create a force on that brain. And so we target the same kind of general area, but they don't get a craniotomy. They are anesthetized, but it's a small hit. We let them kind of go with the force. We calculate the force of that hit, and it's not enough to like, we're not seriously injuring them. We actually use what we call a multiple milds. So these are actually subconcussive hits. So within a second or so, they're usually up and about again. And it's not a full concussion. Our idea is kind of things like, I use an example here, is like football players. So often football players, or even sometimes soccer players, get subconcussive hits. So it's not enough that they would have not passed the football, what do they call it now? The head check, whatever they're calling, the concussion testing. They wouldn't not pass the concussion testing, but these are the ones that we actually see later on that tend to be the kind of problematic ones for those groups. And so that's how we study that. Yes, and military weapons, again, give subconcussive hits often. And so those are often the people who many years later are like, oh, what's wrong? And it was like, that was my job for 10 years, was being on a military range, and I've had subconcussive hits.
This we need to come to a close. Want to respect everybody's time, but I have to ask a question because I love this. Zebra finches are a really, really great and interesting model in neuroscience, not just because you get to do these types of experiments, you get to do great brain recordings, but they're also a really important model for like learning.
Yes.
They have this almost teacher-student dynamic.
They do.
Zebra finches where the parent zebra finch teaches the males how to sing their song. And it's really, really important for them to sing their song for reproduction. And I'd love if you've ever thought about.
I just want to, technically, the
Yep.
aunties are actually the ones giving the feedback
That's
on
true.
the quality
That's true.
of the song.
Yeah.
Technically,
That's right.
technically, I just want to say that.
The aunties give them feedback on the quality of the song. The uncles are the ones like singing the song for them to like initially hear the song. Yeah. Have you ever thought about the traumatic brain injury work, you know, for the younger zebra finches, the learning ones, and seeing how it affects their like learning rate, their ability to pick up the song?
Great question.
Yeah, we did that, and we found they're very good at it. So, and what I mean by that is that because of the strength of that need to have a good song, it is not easily disrupted. And so we can give them an injury early in life, and they are still able to pick up a song, and it's usually still a pretty good quality song. I had a poor student who spent 2 years working on that to come out with Yeah, it's still a good quality song. Like they put a lot of energy into that song. And because it's a practice, that even if you disrupt the injury at the time that they're learning it, they can still kind of practice and they learn to kind of still do a good quality song. We did not see huge disruptions in their singing behavior. I mean, it never stopped them from singing. It was just a slight variation in their singing behavior depending on when you did it. Yeah. It's the wonders of the power of reproduction. We can talk about that later on, but some of those drives are very strong.
I think it's a beautiful note to end on. That like even in the face of something difficult, you can still do the things that are important.
Exactly. It was incredibly resilient. And we were like, oh, okay, that's good to know. Yeah.
Great. Everybody, big round of applause and thank yous for Dr. Kelli Duncan.
Thank you, Kelli Duncan.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
For our Talk to scholars, our cure educators, our folks working in the classrooms, we'd love to debrief with you on this lecture afterwards. Our wonderful colleague Lena has posted a link. It says Talk to Scholars Focus Group link. Please click into that if you can. We'd love to see you there and chat more with a conversation led by Dr. Paris Wicker about your reflections, your experience, what you're going through in the classrooms now. Dr. Duncan, if you can, we'd love for you to join us as well for the focus group conversation. For all of the others, we are so grateful that you joined us for the first Community Neuroscience accessible lecture of this year, but we have other lectures happening soon. On this same topic of plasticity. One is going to be led by Dr. Sebastian Alvarado, an assistant professor at Queens College, and we're going to be following up with you all with a link for that soon in March. Would love to see you for that conversation. And then a following conversation with Dr. Gina Poe in May on sleep and the importance of sleep for our brains. So looking forward to seeing you at more Community Neuroscience Initiative lectures, and looking forward to see how you take this information and incorporate it into your lives and into your science. With that, again, really, really appreciate it. And if our amazing Talk to scholars can click into our focus group link, we'll continue the conversation there. And for the rest of you, we hope that you have a happy and a healthy Saturday.
See you on